following is my conversation with Jonathan Sherwood. Jonathan is one of the most thoughtful people in the cycling business that I've ever met. He currently is director of sales for Power Sports for EMEA at Bell Helmets. He has previously held the role of director of brand marketing for the UK's largest distributor, Zyro Fisher, as well as global brand marketing director for Bell Helmets. He's worked for Mizuno, for Fox Racing, and he actually started his own distribution company in South Africa at like 20 years old. So the guy has seen a lot, and I am really, really happy to have him on today so you can hear and kind of peek inside this guy's way of seeing the business, which is very, very interesting. So Jonathan Sherwood, thank you for taking the time today. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for inviting me on the show. I've listened to the previous ones and really, really interesting, great thoughts and ideas. So excited to be part of it.
Yeah, man, you are in my career. You're one person that we worked on a couple projects, one particular for Santini when you were working with Zyro Fisher.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun kind of putting together some campaigns. And so I wanted to reach out to you because I've always loved talking about cycling with you. You've worked, maybe we can get started with you telling me about, how you got started. I think you started with motorcycles or with motorcycle equipment. But anyway, You can maybe just tell us, where you're from and then kind of how you got into the wild world of cycling.
Sure. So going back a long time now, I actually started out in design communication, and out of college, well, I guess it depends if you're into it or not, but I started out in the FMCG world. So I worked for a small agency that focused on fast-moving consumer goods. And
I haven't heard that acronym before.
Yeah, so fast-moving consumer goods is basically everything you see in your local supermarket, right? Everything from food products, household cleaners, soaps, shampoos, all that sort of stuff. And I worked in a small agency who's had two clients. One was Unilever, and the other one was Tiger Brands.
You're from South Africa, right?
Correct, yeah. So this was on the east coast of South Africa in a town called Durban. And I'm sure many people are familiar with Unilever. They're a huge owner of everyday brands. And that's kind of where I cut my teeth. That agency specifically did their below the line marketing. So we used to do everything from working with the brand manager at Unilever, specifically on new products or new categories, and how they would pitch that product to the buyers at the various supermarkets. And then if they were successful at getting that product, whether it was a soap or a new brand of tea or whatever it was, into the supermarket, we then worked on the launch campaign, the packaging, the in-store execution. Pretty much we did everything up until it got to radio and television, and that's where we stopped. And that was fascinating for me, as a person who grew up in a beach town where surfing and skating and BMX was kind of what everybody did. That was polar opposite, but I learned so much about brand in that role. And it was fascinating for me, seeing the parallels with, for example, tea, right? Like a lot of people have quite a strong preference about the brand of tea they drink, but the reality is much of the ingredients in that box comes from the same farms all over the world, right? And people have these real passionate feelings about, this is the brand I buy and I will pay a premium for it. But there's not that much different when it actually comes to what's in your mug or cup of tea. So that for me was fascinating, and how we positioned these brands and the work we did to do that really resonated with me. For example, as a kid who grew up skateboarding, every skateboard is 7 layers of maple plywood. But once again, people are passionate about the skateboard they use or choose to buy. So it kind of took what I'd subconsciously known as a skater, BMXer kid, and really elevated into mainstream, right? And the kind of economy behind it all. And I did that for a couple of years. Loved every minute of it, but kind of got tired of, building brands around soaps and cheese and that type of stuff. And I decided to start my own business, which was a cycling distribution business in South Africa. And I started importing and distributing specifically American and British brands into the UK. And using all those things I learned working in fast-moving consumer goods, to try and do a better job of building those brands in the cycling economy. And this was around the year 2000. And in South Africa, for example, most distributors were still using Excel spreadsheets to take orders and that type of thing. And because my business was really small, we built a website and we built an online B2B, and you couldn't actually transact on the B2B, but the dealer could kind of see a whole product range. They could see what was in stock and what wasn't in stock, and they could download a file and then fax it through to us or whatever to take an order. So we kind of did things differently. And one of the things which I learned a lot about working in with Unilever specifically was what they call trade presenters. So when they go to a buyer, they build these really awesome packs which talk about the brand, the product, features, benefits, and why they should stock it. And I started building this sort of trade presenter style documents around the brands I was distributing. Anyway, that's kind of how I got into the cycling distribution business. I ran that business for 7 years.
So you started your own distribution company. Did you have partners?
No, it was my dad, actually. He saw my passion for it, and he actually cashed in his pension early and let me use pension to start that business. Yeah, so there's nothing like having your dad's pension on your shoulders to teach you about responsibility, right?
Oh my goodness.
And a return on investment. So
it was profitable?
Yeah, well, this is also something which is really interesting. So the business boomed on paper, right? So our turnover doubled year on year for 7 years. But the interesting thing is, and I learned this obviously in my early 20s, when your business doubles year on year, but you're only making high 20s, low 30s in terms of margins, you're actually building a hole. You're not building a profit, right? So that was a real steep learning curve in terms of building a brand and building a business. And that on paper, it's really successful, certainly to people outside. We were selling more than ever before. Every single year, our orders were going up. Our brands were really happy with the work we were doing. But I was constantly working with business loans with the bank to subsidize the growth, right? So eventually,
so the margin. I want to explain this. So the margins just were really, really thin for your operations.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think the margins were fairly standard, right? And I think if I had, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but going back at that, the correct approach would have been to curb the growth, right? So instead of saying, hey, I can get 50% more orders, I will take 50% more orders and use, financial instruments to fund that. You could have probably said, actually, I'm only going to take 25% growth because that's how much money I'm making. And,
not going to debt.
Exactly, right? So we chased the growth.
So it was the debt that was kind of the gap. The cost of the debt was where you lost a lot of margin.
If you're 15% short of your annual turnover every year in terms of buying the stock, you then borrow that extra 15% to fund it, right?
Right.
That's what I did for basically 6 years. We were just borrowing to fund the growth. And I say the royal we, it was me running the business. And then eventually, light bulb goes off and you're like, this is perpetual state, right? At some point, you got to curb it. So that's what we did. We just said, okay, we've reached a certain point. We're going to cap growth. We're not going to go for growth now. We're just going to manage the business at this size.
To generate cash flow. You wanted to generate some cash flow. Okay, totally. I see.
Totally. So it did basically for 2 years then, we curbed our enthusiasm, pegged the size of the market and the size of growth we're going for. And we, as you say, returned back into a cash positive position. And that was 2 more years. So that business was basically 8 years old, and I'd poured my heart and soul into it and done all sorts of things. And at the time I was in my late 20s, and I was like, you know what? I've spent my whole 20s on a crash course in operations, logistics, distribution, taxation, sales, marketing, go-to-market strategy. And I was like, you know what? Like, maybe it's time to make a call here, right? And it was like, either I go all in, hire more people. And I wasn't single-handed, to be clear. Like, I had some really good people working with me. It was a small business, but I employed 3 people. So I had a guy who worked with me at HQ and basically helped me do the pick, pack, and ship side of things. I had 1 sales rep on the road, and then I had a person doing the accounts, basically. So it was a super small business. And I kind of said, hey, like, do I step this thing up and really go for it, branch out? At the time, that was right when like Red Hook Crit and the fixed gear scene was really kicking off. And on the other side, there were some really cool motorcycle brands emerging out the US that I thought could do well in South Africa. And I was kind of like, where do I go with this thing? And it really was a decision where I had to kind of really ramp it up or pass it on to someone else who could kind of do it. And I decided to do the latter. So we ended up merging the business with a company called RSS, which was Revolution Skateboard Supplies. And they were a similar type of business in South Africa, but focused on surf and skate. So I ended up going to work for them and basically integrated my business into theirs. And once again, really interesting. It was the first time I worked really deeply on surf and skate brands, particularly footwear and apparel. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that the challenges with apparel and lifestyle are not too different to the cycling industry. But yeah, it was, once again, really cool industry, culturally really rich and diverse in terms of all the peripheral stuff like art and music and that sort of thing. And then 2 years in, I got a call from a good friend of mine who was the marketing director for Fox Racing in Europe. And he had worked with me in South Africa when I was doing my own distribution. I also used to do all of the events for them. So I used to run and manage a lot of their events. And he kind of said he was building out the marketing team in Europe. And he said he'd love for me to, if I'm open to it. I moved to the UK where at the time the Fox Europe head office was, and become part of the marketing team there. So jumped at that opportunity. By that point, my company had fully integrated into RSS. There was no more sort of loose ends there. And yeah, I moved to the UK. Once again, I mean, Fox is a very well-known brand in cycling as well as power sports. And at that time, they were actually also really focused on surf, which is something they don't do anymore, and wakeboard and all sorts of other stuff. But really interesting time there. That was actually a period at Fox where they were moving from a privately owned business, and that they were moving towards a direct model across Europe. And they were looking for investments, and the Fox family was kind of looking to take a back seat. So really, really interesting working with them on that over a few years in terms of taking back market.
There was some expansion happening.
Exactly. What's required in taking a brand. So a fascinating period working with them through that. And ultimately that culminated with the brand moving the European head office from Gateshead in the northeast of the UK to Barcelona, where it still is today. And like I said, just a great learning on the business and the economy side of it. Fox is an incredibly powerful brand from a marketing and brand perspective, but the business side of it there was really fascinating going through that transition. After that, I chose not to move to Barcelona, and I got a job at Mizuno Sportswear. And it was kind of an interesting one for me because when you work in the cycling industry and sporting goods industry, there's kind of always this little thing where you see stuff like Adidas and Nike launching new football boots or running shoes, and they do such an amazing job and the budgets look really incredible. And as a marketeer and a brand builder, you're like, wow, that looks super exciting. And going to Mizuno was potentially, for me, I was like, maybe this is a stepping stone to kind of doing that type of thing. But it was interesting because Mizuno is an amazing brand, and it's Japanese, and Japanese are really focused on quality, and I loved that. And learning about running shoes and stuff was amazing. But it was probably the first time I woke up in the morning and realized that so much of what I do is driven by a personal passion for certain categories. And I love the brand, I love the team there, but getting up in the morning and trying to get excited about golf clubs was harder work than I thought, right? So did that for a short while and was then contacted by Zyro Fisher. And Zyro Fisher had just got the distribution rights for Bell and Giro and Eastern. They knew that the Fox office, which actually was located quite close to them, had recently relocated. And there was a lot of staff that hadn't gone over, and they were reaching out to various members of Fox staff to see if they wanted to come on board. And I came on board to look after their marketing for Zyro Fisher.
Zyro Fisher, let's help people understand, is a UK-based cycling-specific distributor. I think it's the biggest one in the UK, isn't it?
It's certainly one of the biggest. I would say it's top two for sure. At the time, yes, they were cycling specific. Now they do a whole lot more. They're quite active in the outdoor market. and they're branching out into things like Power Sports. But yes, at the time, it was still a privately owned business. Husband and wife owned it, and they were focused very much on cycling. Another great business, was really good working with a small privately owned business. Owner founders are always very passionate about their businesses, and everything that you do is a reflection on them personally.
Sure.
And Simon and Julie, who founded and ran that business, really gave me a lot of personal freedom to kind of do my thing there, and it was great. There was Bell and Giro are exciting brands to work on. We kind of really, it was almost a perfect storm, because right around that time, both of those brands also had phenomenal new product coming to market as well, and we kind of went with that. And many people in the cycling world will remember things like the Empire shoe and the Air Attack helmet and the Synth helmet. We were all part of launching those products into the UK, and Bell really changed the game with the super helmet on the mountain bike side. So great fun, a lot of good work there. And I was actually asked a couple of years later by the guys at Bell if I'd move to the US and work for them in their office in Scotts Valley. So I did that for 2 years, led the global marketing for Bell across all the categories they work in.
Wait, hold on. So when you were at Zyro, yes. Zyro Fisher, you were doing Bell and Giro, but were you doing the whole portfolio, or was it just?
Oh yeah, we did everything. Yeah, we did everything.
Because you guys also do. Is it Endura? No, I'm sorry, Altura.
Altura, correct. So Altura is a house brand of theirs.
Right.
It was founded by Simon Ellison, who was the founder of the business. And yes, that was a really interesting one, because a lot of these big international brands will deliver a lot of content and assets and campaigns to distributors, and then the distributors' jobs to then leverage that in their market. Altura was ground up, like literally blank sheet of paper. We had nothing, and we would build those campaigns all in-house. And looking back at that time, we once again had a pretty small team, but I think the work that team did was phenomenal. And I think a lot of people didn't realize that literally everything was done in-house. Of course, if you go back to sort of this was around 2013, 2014, there were a lot of agencies, I guess, or a number of agencies that kind of focused on cycling, but not like it is today, right? Like today, there are a lot of agencies that focus on cycling and creating that type of content. Back then, there wasn't. And we did a lot of that in-house. And I think, all things considered, I think they did a really good job, and we built that brand up significantly.
So dealing on a distributor side, before we talk about you heading over to Bell, so working on the distributor side, can you just speak about quickly, for a distribution company, you're dealing with brands, you're not the brand, but you're dealing with brands. And I'm really curious to understand, during that period, the pressure from online retailers that you saw, and sort of the transition, people that work in cycling, that there was sort of a revolution in distribution in the last, from 2005 to 2020, 22, where these online retailers kind of really just kind of sucked the air out of the room for the independent dealers in certain categories. Can you just speak on that a little bit? Because a lot of people are curious about it, and I think you have an interesting, you had an interesting perspective on that.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things which build quite a complex narrative on this one. So firstly, I think it depends quite heavily on a brand strategy and how they want to go to market, right? And I certainly can't speak for all distributors, but distributors as a whole need to understand where they add value, right? And some distributors, you could argue, see their value being more traditional, which is, we take the stock risk, we hold the inventory, we have a sales team, and we push it out into the market. And then there are other distributors who consider themselves more brand builders, right? And you're seeing the distribution model evolve today, where some distributors, with distribute in inverted commas, literally host a B2B, and they allow brands to simply plug in there, and the brands manage their own sales teams and their own marketing teams. And then you get the inverse. You get some distributors who position themselves more as brand builders and the face of the brand in the market, and then the brand takes the stock risk, and the model is evolving. But I think back then, I think what you saw broadly is the more established, larger distributors didn't rush to the large
Online,
online
online
players.
merchants. Yeah.
Correct. And, I think
Was that a
until
mistake?
I'm going to say no, right? Because I don't know of a single distributor who didn't immediately sort of jump into that channel, have had sort of long-term challenges because of it, right? I think the lay of the land today differs from what it was back then, and of course we're speaking in generalizations here, but I think I can't think of a big distributor who decided to keep, that pure player channel at arm's length who's really suffered because of it. I think if anyone jumped in, it was smaller brands who were looking to unlock Europe or the
Sure.
UK, who
Yep.
went straight to those channels and used them to get immediate reach.
Sure.
Or it was small distributors who, for various reasons, maybe their portfolio was quite focused in a certain category, which meant that retailers weren't necessarily super enthused to open new accounts and have to set up new credit limits and deal with another B2B and all that sort of stuff. It resulted in them perhaps not getting the traction they wanted or whatever. Those smaller distributors, I feel, and the singular brands who are looking for overnight reach were the ones who kind of dived in there, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
these marketplaces, they have to be controlled. And I think what you're saying is to deal with these large marketplaces, it's not simple, and you do have to do it with a lot of caution, because otherwise they can sort of drag you where it's like getting a tiger by the tail. But I had a conversation with Licata of Crank Brothers, and he put it best, because I've had tons of conversations with brand owners where, some of them will swear against Amazon. And Gospel, I said, you have to go where the customers are,
Mm-hmm.
right? Your product needs to be where the customers are. And it was a great example, because people are on Amazon. People want to shop on Amazon. They spend time there because it's fast and it's convenient.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, brands have there's an opportunity to grow by working with Amazon. You do have to keep them at arm's length, and you do have to control them. But for small products that a dealer, your dealer network doesn't want to stock, or perhaps doesn't want to invest in, you, you know, it's logical that you're going to go to an Amazon, or eventually, I know Decathlon is getting a marketplace open now. So I mean, I think it just comes down to what does your customer or potential customer base, where are they spending their time and where are they shopping? Is that fair?
I I agree with that. I think it actually goes deeper than that, though. For me, and this I think is still very specific to the cycling industry. People are fixated with the channel, right? And you'll often speak to distributors or brands that have go-to-market strategies that are like, this is what we're going to do for the IBD. This is what we're going to do for the online store. This is what we're going to do in omni-channel. This is what we're going to do in marketplaces. And I actually think that's wrong. Well, nothing's wrong or right. It depends on what you want to achieve. But for me, what's far more important is forget about the type of channel it is and look at the specific of the fascia. So is that fascia one that can accurately represent your brand? Is that fascia one that can accurately talk about and represent your product? Is that fascia one that has an ongoing relationship with your end customer or not? And that might be an independent dealer in a town that's got a really good community built around a store, and they do weekly rides and they do workshops in the
Sure.
evenings to teach people how to do stuff. And that might be a big pan-European internet store, right? Who really puts a lot of content around your brand, uses all the photography provided, puts great videos there, has a live chat system that helps people choose product and that type of thing. Like, I think just looking at the channel is a very blunt way of approaching it. And for me, it's about the fascia. Does the fascia serve the product, the brand, and ultimately your consumer in a positive way, right? So that's that. I think that's an evolution that the cycling industry is still kind of going through, right? And I think we're still tripping up on this
Sure.
channel piece.
Yeah, no, it's
Um,
absolutely. But okay, so let's talk about helmets because you work in helmets.
yeah,
And from my experience, helmets are tentatively marketplace friendly in a sense that helmets are a product that on a marketplace it works because there's a lot of variants, a lot of colors, a lot of sizes, so it's harder for a dealer to stock the whole assortment. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement. I don't think it's necessarily a barrier that defines a market as a, that defines the marketplace being a better channel for it. I think the other side of helmets is that they're highly technical products and they also fit really close to the body, right? So comfort and fit is a super important piece.
So to be able to
So
try one out is a huge added value.
totally. And I think, the if it comes to being able to choose from one of 12 colors or one of five in a dealer, there is a benefit to be able to walk in there, put it on your head, and make sure it's something that you're really comfortable using, especially if you're doing hundreds of miles in it and that type of thing.
And they're
But
expensive.
to your point, like I think range is is a really interesting dynamic in the market because do consumers need 20 colors of a jersey or do consumers need, 15 different colors of helmet or whatever it is? Probably not, right? For me, I think that's more to do with channel management and product line segmentation. Can you use these things of, like whether it's SMU product or specific SKUs or even specific products to allow these channels to live more easily together, right? And I mean, once again, speaking in generalizations, I feel like cycling's way behind the curve on this. I mean, you look at sportswear brands, they have products. Let's just use shoes as an example. You go to a big mainstream footwear store and they will have, whatever is Nike, Adidas, Vans, they will have a range in there. If you then go to your premium independent running store down the road, yes, they have the same brands in there, but not necessarily the same product. And I think we need to be mindful of the scale of mainstream sportswear. Lots of people wear running shoes, even if they don't run, right? So they have this market that's really broad and these huge volumes that allow them to do that. But the fact remains, I think choice doesn't have to just be about the customer. Choice can also be about brands strategically placing products in different channels so that all ships rise together, right? And it's not this bun fight for every single consumer's dollar. And I'm not sure that in cycling we're really doing that yet. I mean, I think there's signs of it happening, which are super positive, I think. But, I wouldn't say it's something that we've mastered the art of as an industry.
So you went from working on the distributor side at Zyro Fisher, and then you had the opportunity to go and move to the brand side, which would have been the first time that you worked directly for a brand when you
No,
went
that would have been Fox.
Fox.
Fox would have
Okay,
been the
sorry.
first
Yep,
time. Yeah. So
Fox,
this was
and
the
then
second time. To be clear, though, when I worked at Fox, I was working purely on EMEA. But when
sure
I went to Bell was the first time I was working at a
head
global level.
office.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So yeah, then I went to Bell.
what was your role there
I was global director of brand marketing.
for Bell?
Yeah,
Bell, the brand Bell.
correct. So
Okay.
looking after all the categories, bike, power sports, everything from road to urban commute, and then on the motorcycle side, street, lifestyle, motocross, and off-road. And yeah, phenomenal. I think
You moved to
I think
America for the first. This is
yeah,
the first
so
time you'd lived in America.
it was an interesting commute because my family was still in the UK. So I was working in the US and my wife and kids were in the UK. So I used to do anything between 6 and 8 weeks in the US. And then
Wow.
I'd come back to the UK and then spend sort of 2 or 3 weeks in the UK. And of those 2 or 3 weeks, I'd normally do one week sort of in Europe somewhere visiting a distributor or something like that. So
Your
yeah, it
family
was
your family didn't want to move to California, or why didn't you make the move?
no, to be honest, it was an interesting one. That was the plan the whole time, but a combination of various things, largely around visas and working visas and that type of thing, basically just strung the whole thing out for a long, long time. But it was amazing, honestly. Like, and as you know, I'm now back at Bell, but I did that for 2 years and really enjoyed it. I mean, the on a personal level, I think one of the things which is really fantastic about working brand side is the focus and the clarity of purpose, right? I mean,
Sure.
in a distributor, you've got to wear many hats. And I think you really, in a distributor, you get this unrivaled experience of the economy of the industry, right? Working across multiple brands, all those brands having different strategies, wants, needs, desires, all catering to different consumers. You know, you have to use different channels, different dealers, all sorts of things to actually unlock that business. And the business and economic side of distribution work is unrivaled, and you know, hard to get that knowledge and insight working purely for a brand. On the brand side, you have this absolute clarity of purpose, which is super refreshing, and it allows you to kind of really deep dive into the brand, and that I found really good. So yeah, I was based out of Scotts Valley for a couple of years, building all of the obviously marketing assets, campaigns, and the strategies around new product launches and that type of thing. And you know, the motorcycle industry is not too dissimilar from the cycling industry. In my current role now, I'm focused back on the power sports side of things, and perhaps something we can touch on later or a different podcast. But for me, what's fascinating is this road that power sports and cycling are on, and at what point that will converge, right? And
can you clarify what power sports means in the industry?
So power sports is an industry term that basically refers to motorcycle business, two wheels. So auto is four wheels, power sports is two wheels. So anything with an engine that has two wheels in the industry is considered to be power sports.
An ICE engine, internal combustion engine. Okay.
Well, not necessarily, right? Up to this point, of course, it has been. But I mean, I think this is the piece I'm really excited about. We're seeing the electrification of motorcycles and the electrification of bicycles really coming together super quickly. And I think what's interesting for me is you'll be hard pressed to find a leading motorcycle brand that hasn't made investments in e-bikes or e-mobility, but you're not seeing that on the cycling side, right? You know, I'm certainly not aware of a cycling brand that's pursuing some sort of non-pedal assisted urban vehicle or otherwise. And that is really fascinating. And I could talk about it for hours, but I think there's a lot of talk in the cycling industry now about urban mobility. You know, we're seeing in the media things about 15-minute cities and
mobility in general.
How society might change and how we might move and behave. And I think, perhaps I'm speaking out of term here, but I feel like perhaps the cycling industry is working on the assumption that people, when they choose to perhaps not invest in a motor vehicle, they will by default choose an e-bike or an e-cargo bike or something like that. And I think there is a significant movement from the power sports industry that is encroaching on that cycling market at pace. And I think the cycling industry would be wise to perhaps look over its shoulder.
Really? Okay. So you're saying that potentially some big motorcycle, sorry for the term, but power sports manufacturers could be eating the bicycle manufacturers' lunch very soon in a certain way.
For sure. And look, I don't think it needs to be a war between the two, right? I'm just saying that this is...
Well, somebody has to sell the bikes.
that are converging on a consumer, right? They're converging on a consumer. And I think you look at and I'm speaking largely here about urban mobility, right? Because a lot of people, even today, that are using bicycles or e-scooters to travel around the city or the suburbs are not passionate cyclists. They're not consuming endemic cycling media and that type of thing. They're everyday people who are choosing to use bicycles or e-bicycles or e-scooters to get around the city because it's convenient and affordable, and you know, it suits their evolving lifestyle. But for me, I think where the danger comes is, let's say you've got a family that are using the local rental e-scooters to get around, get the kids to school and back, or whatever it happens to be. We reach a point in their lives where they say, okay, we're so used to using this type of light electric vehicle to get around that we actually want to invest in something slightly larger, maybe something we can use to do the shopping with or whatever it happens to be. Is the assumption now that they will then go and buy an e-bicycle with cranks on it to pedal around with an assisted engine after spending, weeks or months using a twist throttle scooter? Or are they going to go to their local power sports dealer and buy a twist and ride sub 35 mile an hour scooter, right? I think there's an assumption in the bicycle world that people will migrate to the bicycle. And maybe that assumption is based on the fact that there's legislation around motorcycles in terms of licensing and stuff, and that's a barrier to entry. Therefore, they'll go for the bicycle.
Sure.
But you don't need a license to ride a motorcycle under 35 miles an hour. You need a CBT. It takes you an hour to get one, and off you go, right? So I just think it's really interesting. And then there's brands, for example, like there's a brand that's emerging very rapidly called Cake, which is an electric motorcycle brand doing super innovative stuff that is right on the doorstep of the cycling world, that I feel is probably more tangible to a non-endemic cyclist than perhaps an e-bike. And then you got brands like Yamaha, for example, who are launching a whole range of mountain bikes. And they have for a long time, don't get me wrong, there's nothing new. But what's interesting about Yamaha is they've just launched a whole new range. They're not even calling on cycling stores with those e-mountain bikes. They're going to their power sports stores and they're saying, hey, alongside the motorcycles, we want you to sell these mountain bikes.
Wow.
So they're completely bypassing the cycling channel. Now, the interesting thing is for the cycling brands, if power sports stores are actively pursuing eMTB and potentially in the future e-urban, what about the tires? What about the brake pads? What about all those consumables? Is that consumer who now knows his whatever local power sports dealer going to buy a e-bike from there? And then do they have to take it to their local bicycle store to get serviced? I don't think they will, right? They're going to take it back to the store they bought it from because that's where the warranty lies. That's where the history lies. So potentially there's a whole untapped market there for the cycling industry, just in consumables alone, right? Now, all of a sudden, motorcycle stores need bicycle helmets. Now, all of a sudden, motorcycle stores need saddles and bar tape and whatever else, right? So, I mean, I digress massively, but it's just super interesting, right? Like,
you're right.
These are so close together now. It feels like a tinderbox, like it's going to take a spark and all of a sudden, like it's one, and for me, that's super exciting and super interesting to follow.
From my experience, so I've spent a lot of time in Germany in the last year or so, and the e-bike business in Germany is huge, absolutely enormous. But I think that is more of a cultural characteristic because it just, middle-aged German people, for whatever reason, have decided that an e-bike is, part of a lifestyle. But what you're talking about is a bit larger, just kind of mobility in general. So,
and to your point about the German consumer, right? I think it's easy and it's correct to point out their affinity to e-bikes. But before the e-bike, that market was hugely successful with effectively touring bikes before that, right? So, I think it's important to acknowledge as an industry that, like, I don't think it was the e-bike that unlocked that. They were, touring in Germany and the Netherlands has always been a strong category. And I agree with you in terms of infrastructure and accessibility. It's been great, right? You feel safer just riding a bike around cities there. You feel like you're more accommodated. It's awesome. And then, e-bikes, I think, just took it to another level because all of a sudden now you have to put in, although there are conflicting articles around this, and I saw one recently that argued that you put in as much effort on an e-bike as you do on a normal bike. But I think the premise is that these type of consumers felt, I really enjoy touring on a bike. I really enjoy moving across the city on a bike. Now I can use an e-bike and it's even more efficient. It just makes sense. But once again, I think the point I'm making is, and it's a generalization, of course, but I think there's an argument there that a lot of these consumers were using bicycles as an existing mode of transport and we're comfortable with the bicycle as an existing mode of transport. I think as we see sort of councils and lobby groups and governments continue to champion alternate forms of transport from the motor vehicle, all of a sudden now we have people who have no affinity to cycling looking to make choices about what type of vehicle they and their families use. And I'm not sure the logical step is necessarily a bicycle store. I think there's potential for the motorcycle stores now all of a sudden to have a really compelling proposition.
For mobility.
Yeah, basically. And I'm not predicting the future here. I'm just saying these are really interesting thought experiments, right? Like, where will the industry go? Where will the market go? Ultimately, where will that consumer choose? And what type of vehicle will that consumer choose? And where does the cycling industry fit into that?
So you're now back at Bell, because you went from Bell in the US back to Zyro Fisher for a period of time.
Correct. So I went back to Zyro Fisher in a slightly different role. So my first stint at Zyro Fisher was purely marketing based. Second time around, I was director of the brand portfolio and marketing. So looking after obviously the portfolio of brands, those relationships, and then, you know, the commercial strategies behind each of those brands. And once again, like on the distribution side, I think the plug and play days of old are long gone. And, you know, if you have a distribution with 25 brands, you literally have 25 different go-to-market strategies and 25 different.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So
yeah.
Let's talk. Can we talk a little bit about how the centralization of brands has happened in the last 5 to 10 years? Because I think what I've seen is that in the past, the distributors were much more influential in terms of how they approach the market. Whereas now what you just said, that there's actually a fully functioning and pretty sophisticated strategy coming from every single brand that these distributors need to then, you know, implement. So can you talk about how, because what I've seen is that there's a centralization, and I think you're a good person to talk to this about, the centralization of the messaging because of digital channels. So I guess in that vein, what have some of these effects been? Because it seems like brands want to take back control of the communication through the digital channels, but it's not that simple.
No, it's not that simple. And, you know, I think there's quite a few different things to touch on there. So firstly, in terms of a distributor and its role, I think we touched on this briefly earlier. In the good old days, a distributor basically bought product, warehoused it, and then sold it to dealers, right? And we've seen over the last 10 years.
But there wasn't much marketing happening. Is that what you're saying?
No, not always. But I mean, I would argue that, you know, you see some interesting things, right? When you work with a broad portfolio of brands, you get really good insight into how those brands also perform in other markets, whether that's information that comes back to you from the brand or discussions that happen at sales meetings with other distributors. And what's really apparent to me is that different brands perform wildly differently in different parts of the market, right? Now, some of that will be because the brand lacks relevance in other markets, right? Like if you're a brand that makes waterproof commuter clothing for cyclists,
sure,
you're not going to do great in Dubai, right? Everyone knows that.
Nobody needs it.
Totally. But there's another piece to it where there are brands that perform amazingly well in certain countries because of how they are taken to market. And I won't necessarily put all of that credit on marketing, but I always remember in South Africa, the distributor there for, at the time, Pacific Cycle, which later became CSG, did an amazing job with Mongoose, right? Like a brand that in Europe is basically invisible, non-existent.
No,
it's
BMX. About it. Those are BMX bikes, right?
Well, yeah, that's what everyone remembers, right?
Yeah.
But in South Africa, they sold loads of mountain bikes, right? Okay. Loads of mountain bikes.
And that was because
the distributor did a great job placing that product at retail, right? And you would walk into a bike store and Mongoose was always one of the choices you had in front of you. And I think, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a lot of product sells because it's in front of the consumer.
Distribution.
And you can have an amazing marketing campaign
No, you have to
whether
have
it's
distribution.
yeah, totally. Like you can have an amazing marketing campaign. Doesn't matter if that's driven by a distribution partner or a brand itself. But if the consumer cannot convert on that campaign, it's may as well not have even been created, right? Like so yes, going back to the what was a multifaceted question, I think distributors in terms of their roles are much more complex than it used to be. Some brands are looking for partners that can simply operate a 3PL style model. They're happy to do the marketing themselves, the sales themselves. They're looking for a fulfillment partner. There are other brands that want the opposite. They want someone who can build brand, who knows the market, knows the right places to put the product, and and there's some people that just want a box shifter, but it is complex. And I think distributors need to understand what role they play, where their skill sets lie, and where they add value. And then it's for them to play for, right? And I think marketing can be a big piece of that. Speaking to your question about the brand side, taking ownership of the channels, I do think it's important that brands are accurately represented globally, right? The resource required
Consistently represented.
correct. The resource required to build a strong brand is immense. And if that's undermined through inaccurate representation, it's an erosion. So once again, whether brands take back control of that themselves or whether they use agencies or partners or distributors to do that, I think depends entirely on the brand's strategy and the skill sets and the people they lean on. But yes, I agree with you. More so than ever, there needs to be an invisible connection between a brand and its end consumer. I've always been really interested in the distributors who build brand around themselves. I'm not saying this is wrong, but if you look at the distribution landscape right across the world, there are distributors who put a lot of effort into their own brand, right? And
the brand as a distributor or a private label, or what are we talking
as
about?
a distributor, right?
Okay.
Like
That just
argue,
it seems crazy to me. Honestly,
yeah,
it seems
no,
crazy to me.
agreed. I think unless they're doing it to resonate with their customer base, which are the dealers and the channels, like I get that. But there are distributors who seem to try and project themselves onto the end consumer as well. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's interesting. I think more so than ever, though, brands want an unfiltered exchange with end consumers now. And once again, I don't think there's a single way to do that. I don't think there's a best way to do that. It depends entirely on the market and the strategy and the brand behind it. But, consumers want to interact directly with the brand. They want to, authenticity, credibility, relevance is an exchange that happens one-to-one, not broken telephone, right? And I think managing that is increasingly important for brands going forward.
Okay, well, I want to go back to Amazon again then, because I think I saw you. I know this is a tough subject, but I'm sorry, I'm going back to it. So Amazon is where a lot of people spend time, right? Yeah. It's where a lot of people spend time. It's where lots of human beings, like 85% of American households have Amazon Prime. Okay. Mm. Brands need to be there.
Yeah.
Okay. But what you're saying is that the representation of the brand on a platform like that needs to be consistent. That's what your take is on something like Amazon.
Yes. And I think, this is kind of, I'll digress and then I'll come back onto the point, right? Like there's generally speaking in the cycling industry, a trend you see where when brands try and solve this conundrum of Amazon, pure player, independent, they tend to cherry pick a few products that are typically like they're more high-end stuff, the more technical stuff, the more expensive stuff. And they say, I tell you what, we'll take these really premium high-end bits and pieces and we'll make that only available to the independents, right? And then the rest of our range will allow, broader distribution through all these channels, including Amazon. It's an interesting strategy, and I think many people have employed it for a long time, and I think it's an effort to sort of manage those channels, which is admirable. But then you think about what you're actually offering that independent who based on the notion of the strategy, is the channel you offering preferential treatment to. You're offering them a product that has a very narrow consumer base, is probably relevant to a very small proportion of your dealers and an even small proportion of their customers. The person who's going to spend 10,000 plus on a bike or 400 plus on a helmet, for an independent dealer to sell that is quite an art, and they need to, have a really, I guess, a customer base that's really focused on that product. The flip side to that for me is, how about a strategy where the independents only get the bread and butter? Imagine if chains and cassettes and brake pads were only sold to independent dealers, not Amazon, not pure players. Once again, I'm not saying this is the right way. This is just a thought experiment, right? Like, what would happen if we did this? What happens if the bread and butter every day that almost every independent, if that is your preferred channel, if that is the channel you want to offer preferential treatment to, make the bread and butter exclusive to them. And then your really high end, really premium, 1 in 100 customers are going to buy it piece
on the wider
put
channel.
that on the internet, right?
Right.
Where people who are shopping for that product can easily find it and easily get their hands on it. So all of these channels are really important. And I think the thing for me is, if I was to kind of sum up my view on Amazon and everyone else, the problem isn't the channel. The problem is the cycling industry is bringing the same product ranges to market as they always have. They're not providing differentiation in product line or any kind of meaningful channel management strategy. And then they're sitting there going, that channel's good, that channel's bad. And to your point, at the end of the day, we are all here to take brands and their products and put them in the hands of consumers.
That's
right?
my point. That's my point.
Yeah.
And I know that it's not easy for brands. I know that there's no like right or wrong answer here. The reason that I am hammering it is because it is so unbelievably relevant, because there is a tug of war happening, every single day. But I'm gonna take you off the off the hot seat here and give you
totally. And let me kind of draw a line under that then. Like, for me, the issue isn't Amazon, right? The issue is the brands and the industry at large's inability to provide the right product for the right consumer through the right channel and keep that product in that channel. Right. To assume that you can offer your full product to everybody and hope that everyone lives happily together. Never gonna. Yeah. And once again, I don't want to generalize too broadly, but we're speaking about really broad topics here. To be clear, there are people, whether it's brands or retailers themselves or distributors, that are working to put really robust strategies in place to try and manage this. But honestly, like it's a problem that we have the power to solve relatively easily. And when I say easily, I don't mean quickly, but it's about developing product lines that meet consumers' needs and are available to those consumers in the channels where those people are shopping, right? And keeping them in those channels. I don't think it's rocket science, but it will take time, right? Especially with existing product lines, and especially now with so much inventory in the market, given the post-pandemic situation.
Yeah, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to
go. Before anything meaningful happens, that inventory needs to move through.
Sure.
And, I think then those strategies can start to really kind of grow some teeth. But yeah, it's the power is within our hands to get it right. It's not rocket science.
So I just want to go. I want to go through the pandemic through the eyes of a bike industry professional, and I guess what I'm hoping from here is just kind of your take on how it went, the challenges that you guys ran into. You were with Zyro at the time?
I was working for Zyro Fisher.
Can you tell me just kind of just for the record, kind of how it went, and then the post-pandemic? I know we talked about that a little bit, what you're saying now, just because it's so relevant to the business, and it was a really, once in a lifetime event for the system, for the bicycling business.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone went through the pandemic and experienced a typically unique chain of events, right? It was the same for everyone. And you know, I think it's been pretty well documented, the kind of classic boom and bust of the whole thing. For me, I think what it really highlighted is the lack of data, quality data at retail within the cycling industry at large. Because,
Explain that.
well, if we look at, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but if we look at, and hindsight's a beautiful thing, but if we look at what happened there, right, in the rearview mirror, the real kind of challenge was the expansion of lead time, right? So you had demand shooting up, and you had retailer or customers going to retailers asking for a product that they didn't have. That retailer would then go to the brand or the distributor and say, hey, I need this product. That would then filter back in terms of orders and POs to the brands. They would send the orders and POs to the vendor, and you get this huge ramp up of orders going to the vendors. Now, if you imagine that the cycling industry has been a pretty stable industry for a long, long time, when you look at the capacity of these vendors to then ramp up, it was hugely limited. So while they did their best to produce more product, all that really happened was that the lead time extended. So a product that typically had a 6-month production cycle now all of a sudden jumped out to 12 or 18 months. Okay.
So it was an inelastic production chain, production
broadly
infrastructure.
speaking, yes. Okay.
That's what we saw at the beginning. It was very inelastic.
Correct.
Okay.
So people who wanted product and they wanted that product within 6 months ended up waiting 12 or 18 months for that product.
It was just math. It was just boom.
Yeah, totally. Now you look at that in hindsight and you say to yourself, I ordered this volume of product for delivery in 6 months. That product is now only shipping to me in 18. Is that demand still there? Yes or no? Right?
If you look at it that way, it seems a lot more simple.
Totally. And it really was that simple. Is the demand for something 18 months ago still there? And the problem we have is that production is a very binary thing, right? You have a vendor who's ordering raw materials, he's converting those raw materials into products. And if that takes him 6 months like it normally should, or takes him 12 or 18, that raw material was still ordered at day one. The fact that it turned into a product at day 360 instead of day 180 is highly relevant, but it is what it is. Like the raw materials and the pieces to make the bike or the tire or the group set or whatever it was are now in production, right? So my learning from it all is, like, if there was somehow a better handle on how much product was sitting in the market at any given time and what its run rate was, we would have been way ahead of the situation we're in now, right? Which is the market literally has, depends who you speak to and who the brand is, but in some cases, months of overstock, in some cases, years of overstock of certain products and categories. And all of this is hindsight based, right? Like, which is, you know, awesome. But I can't help but feel like if the industry collectively had a better handle on how its products and brands were actually performing, we could have weathered the storm. And I don't know how true this is, right? You hear the kind of overarching narrative that, like, Shimano basically said, we're not going to ramp up any production. We're just going to chug along as we always have. And they were the one brand apparently that didn't do that. I'd be interested to know
that's true or not.
If that's true or not, right?
I've heard that anecdotally as well.
Yeah.
But but what are we saying? You're saying that all these dealers should have called and said, no, cancel my order?
No. So here's another interesting part to that, right? I'm a dealer. All of a sudden, I've got a super high demand for 1,200 euro or 1,200 pound gravel bikes, let's say, right? I need 20 of these things, and I normally only sell like 5 a month. Now I'm selling 20 a month. What do I do? You phone up your supplier and you say, hey, I need 20 bikes this month. The supplier says, sorry, I can't help you.
But I get it to you in 18 months.
No, they just say, but if you want to place an order for it, we'll
Right.
order them.
And
He says,
maybe you
yeah,
can have it in 18 months.
yeah. He says, yeah, okay, order me 20 of those. But he's still got the 5 bikes on his floor that people are ready to wheel out the door. And he's got 15 more people standing in the line saying, I want bikes. So he phones the next supplier and says, hey, I need 15 bikes. Have you got 15 bikes for me? That supplier says, no, I can give you 3. So he says, okay, send me the 3. He
Order
then
me.
phones the third supplier, right? And says, hey, all of these suppliers, the first guy's going, wow, there's demand for 20. The second guy's going, wow, there's demand for 15. The third guy's going, oh, there's demand for 10. All of these
It's one order.
suppliers are recording this demand, right?
It was one
Now,
order.
whether they took a view on that demand and said, we're going to place a bet on 50% of it, 25% of it, 100% of it, we will never know. But I believe there was also a significant portion of the challenge we face is duplicate
Right.
records of demand right across the industry. And to me, that's the only thing that explains some of the volumes of inventory we see, right? So yes, I'm not going to sit here and say that, it could have been completely avoided, and with a little bit of, additional data, it would have been smooth sailing. Absolutely not.
No.
I think if anything, what I'll say is it highlighted the lack of transparency in terms of the nuts and bolts of the business. Like I said, that duplicate demand piece, like, how do we think about that? How do we extrapolate that? How do we prevent that in future? Like, because that through a pandemic is explosive, right? In terms of what it can do for yeah.
I don't know
So
if you can. I really don't. I mean,
yeah.
I think it was just so unique. And one category that I'm always incredibly fascinated with, and I don't know, just because I worked in this category a bunch, is clothing. And it has, at least from what I can see, it has taken a lot of punches
Mm.
because of the oversupply. And I don't know if that's because of an unusually high amount of brands that all kind of, did the duplicate ordering that we're talking about, that
Mm.
those lead times are a bit shorter in clothing. So canceling them was a little bit more difficult. that the, that there were enough producers around Europe and Italy that all of this duplicate demand was actually,
Mm.
fulfilled. But what I'm seeing is that clothing in particular has really, really had a hard time as opposed to maybe other categories. I don't know. Can you speak to that at all?
You know what? This is clothing in particular is something that I've really kind of wrestled with for a long time. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Like, clothing was a tough market before the pandemic, right? And you wrote a really concise and thought-provoking piece recently about the oversupply and the shift in terms of brands in the market. There's no denying that the barrier to entry for apparel tumbled over the last 10 years, right? And I think that played a big piece in terms of saturation of the category. And it's also worth noting that we're not just talking about like niche boutique brands that went to Italy and were able to do small runs of, really premium product. We're talking about significant channels, both in terms of bricks and mortar, bricks and clicks, and pure play, bringing own brand to market, right? So not only were you
Yeah.
seeing an explosion of brands, but the channels that many of these brands were leaning on for sales now started to offer preferential treatment, as you would to your own brand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
DHB and all of these brands.
yeah, I mean, all of these major channels have own brands now. So I just feel like that has made it very hard for apparel brands. And the reality is, this industry is a business. And what I mean by that is, like, there are a lot of people with a deep passion who, cultivate and form brands because, they feel like there's a niche there, or a pocket of consumers that aren't being catered for, and they can do it. But at the end of the day, it's a business, it's an economy. Like, it has to fund itself, it has to be self-sustaining. And like, there are only so many consumers who need a brown pair of bib shorts, right? Like, the minute you get 2 or 3 brands making brown bib shorts, you're just eating each other's lunch. Like, it's so tough. And a few years ago, you'd often people say, "Oh, well, a black bib tite's a black bib tite. We'll just make tons of them because you'll always sell a black bib tite." Yeah, but you and 50 other people said that. So you've now got hundreds of thousands of black bib tite options. Like, what's the differentiator between yours and the one right next to it? And who's prepared to run on the thinnest margin for the longest period of time to make sure that theirs sell through before yours? And like, I just feel like clothing is such a tough market right now.
It's tough, yeah. And someone mentioned the other day that people just got, like, they were just freebasing the demand around COVID, and they just thought that, they just got into it, and they're like, "Oh my God, look at this. I just, put this online, sold through it. Let's keep going." And it inevitably stopped. And I think, yeah, the barriers to entry was a huge part of it. Maybe some passion projects that of people, maybe retired people, or, independently wealthy people, funding some passion projects, could have kind of unnaturally kept some of these projects going, just because cycling does have that sort of nature to it. And just those really small, the opportunity to kind of make small investments to get it started. So yeah, that's really interesting. But
I mean, further to that, though, an interesting piece for me is, if you look at the premium end of cycling apparel, particularly on the road side, and you did that piece on Rafa recently, which was really interesting, and you spoke at length about their real push into content and the quality content and the authenticity of that content. But I think one thing, well, 2 points on that. The first one is, I think that was, and I mean this in the least derogatory way I possibly can, but I think their approach to content has been imitated over and over and over again, even by very reputable brands, brands that I like, brands that I think are great. You can't help but avoid, it's clear that they still have the inspiration of Rafa 6 or 7 years ago and how they brought content to market. However, I think while the industry has moved very quickly to perhaps equal, in some cases even better, but often imitate the content execution of Rafa, I think very few have executed the community building that Rafa did, right? And I actually attribute more of their success to their ability to build community than their ability to execute cinematic quality content. Don't get me wrong, the two go hand in hand. But if I was to be overly critical of premium apparel brands today, the focus is entirely on
content.
And once again, I don't want to sound critical and derogatory of people. I'm just using terms that kind of I use myself. Like, you get low effort and high effort, right? In terms of going to market. 7 or 8 years ago, producing a cinematic video of some guys riding up a coal in the wet and the rain, hearing the hissing of the tires on the wet road.
Don't say drone shot, John. Don't say drone shot.
Totally. Like,
oh,
a few years ago, that
enough
was
of the
high
drone
effort,
shots.
right?
Yeah, it was new.
That was high effort content.
Used to be.
And but if we're honest with ourselves, it's a low effort today.
You're right.
It's hard to do that. And I think brands need to ask themselves, are we going to be successful with low effort or high effort activations? And to be honest, in the market we're in today, if you're not prepared to put in high effort, it's a question of how long can you hold your breath for, right? Because there's so much stock in the market. There's so much choice. And if I'm honest, there's so much similarity across brands and product offerings. if you're not prepared to put in high effort and define what that high effort is, because high effort will be different depending on your brand and your route to market and whatnot. But if you're not prepared to do that or can't afford to do that, you need to ask yourself, how long can you hold your breath for? Because you're basically holding your breath until all that stock moves through. You're hoping that your brand still retains affinity in the market, and you're hoping that you still can take a deep breath when that's all done to keep going again. And
so how are brands going to differentiate then, John? Like where can brands different? You're talking about now that they can do high effort. We're talking about content, but that can also be applied to product, right?
oh no, totally right. And just to be clear, like I think content, lock, stock, and barrel is low effort today. Like
well, I think it's because that the amount has been jacked up with probably the same budget.
Exactly right. So I think it's very hard to argue that a content strategy alone is going to be the difference between success and failure today. And I think there's other forms of marketing. Like think about it, right? So
you're right.
Going back to the point we discussed earlier, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how compelling the asset is. If the consumer cannot convert on it, the asset is useless. So
where is the differentiator then?
a couple things. And once again, this is me kind of shooting the breeze. I'm not,
you are a professional. This is your job.
But like for me, there's two things people need to be mindful of. A, what is your purpose? What is your actual purpose as a brand? And two, do not get distracted by opportunity, right? Without purpose, you have no moral compass as a brand in terms of who you should be targeting, what product you should be making, what need you're serving or solving. Purpose is everything for a brand. And I think you will be, maybe you won't be actually, but I think many people will be outside of doing what we do, might be surprised how few brands can actually give you a boilerplate on what their purpose is, right?
Are you talking about niche, like who they serve, what they do well?
For example, you can pick a brand, and normally the founders can do this. Don't get me wrong, founders can do this, but speak to commercial director, speak to a marketing director, speak to head of product development. What is your brand's core purpose? 30 seconds, go and see what they say.
Elevator pitch.
And do, if those three people are all on the same brand, is what they say the same thing, right? Now more than ever, that is super, super important for a brand, because like I said, it becomes the foundation for everything you do. It becomes a moral compass for your brand going forward. The other thing is, do not get distracted by opportunity. It is so easy to chase opportunity. And the reality is, opportunity is defined by your ability to seize it, not its potential. And there could be 100 opportunities that are all at face value good opportunities come along, right? Maybe it's a new category to go into or a new sales channel to enter. Opportunity comes in many shapes and forms. But if you take 100 opportunities and look at your resource, look at your budgets, look at your sales channels, look at your routes to market, you'll probably find that of those 100 opportunities, 90, even though they're good, you can't achieve. So therefore, they're actually bad. They're bad opportunities. And I think a lot of people just go after every opportunity they can as a brand. I think it's distracting. I think it drains resources. And now more than ever, is probably not the right time to do that. So speaking in very idealistic terms here, right? There's all sorts of things like paying the rent and whatnot that add reality to this. But brand purpose and not being distracted by opportunity for me are certainly front of mind in navigating the current situation.
Well, man, John, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed. We hit a lot of cool points today. I definitely want to do this again sometime.
Sure. That's good. It's awesome. It's an industry that I think we're all very fortunate to work in, and we have awesome jobs, right? But the business of it and the economy of it are super dynamic. And I think cycling in particular is at a really exciting phase in terms of its maturity and its evolution. And yeah, I could talk about this stuff for days.
No, I appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you on social media if they want to if they want to follow you?
So I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Jonathan Sherwood. Pretty easy to find. I am on Instagram, but full disclosure, I haven't posted on Instagram for about 2 years. So
Okay.
tumbleweeds will blow through there. But if you want to connect with me, yeah, LinkedIn, Jonathan Sherwood, you can find me there.
Okay. Thanks, man.
Cool. Anyway, thanks, Wyatt. Been great to catch up. Speak to you soon.
So I'm just gonna stop the recording now, and
Cool.
let's see